You are standing at the edge of silence. The corridor before you is drenched in velvet dusk, lined with walls that once pulsed with whispers and secrets. Candles flicker like dying stars, casting long shadows that stretch across hand-painted panels and dust-choked carpets. The air is thick, not with warmth, but with waiting. Something was always watching here, and something still does. You walk slowly. The ceiling above you arches like the mouth of a cathedral, but this is no place of worship. This is a palace, and the path you're on, it leads to a room that once ruled empires. At the corridor's end is a door, heavy, carved with grotesque floral vines and lions with hollow eyes. It doesn't creak when you open it. It exhales, and you step inside the king's bedroom. But this is no bedroom. It is a vault, a chamber built not for comfort, but for ceremony, not for love, but for power. You are surrounded by blood-red velvet drapes, pulled taut like stage curtains, enclosing a massive canopied bed that resembles a sarcophagus. Too grand, too cold. The mattress is thin, the pillows are hard, and nothing about this place was ever meant for sleep. Here, every object is symbolic, every corner, political. You smell it first, that sweet, sickly blend of rosewater, crushed amber, and decay. The perfume of control, applied not to the body, but to the walls, the bedding, the very air itself. The king did not sleep in darkness. He slept in theatre, and his scent lingered like a signature written in musk. You notice how the windows don't open, how the mirrors don't reflect, and how the golden clock, ticking faintly, has no hands. Time inside this room is not meant to pass. It is meant to pause, for inspection, for ritual. Every morning, the king would awaken not to birdsong or warmth, but to the shuffling of dozens of men, ministers, dukes, physicians, chamberlains. They entered like a court procession, surrounding the bed like vultures. The ritual was called Le Lever du Roi, the King's Rising, and it was no less choreographed than a ballet. He would sit up on cue, be washed on cue, dressed on cue, observed on cue, observed on cue. His royal flesh, as fragile as yours, became a national performance, a daily myth that had to be maintained at all costs. Because here's the truth, they won't tell you in school, The king's body was never truly his. It was a symbol, a breathing emblem of divine right. Every motion in this room, from undressing to bedding, was designed not for pleasure, but for proof. Proof of strength, proof of virility, proof of God's favor. And the bed, that wasn't a bed. It was a throne behind curtains, a place where alliances were whispered, enemies seduced, mistresses elevated, queens dismissed, where a soft sigh could crown an heir, or start a war. It wasn't love that haunted these sheets. It was expectation, sometimes even punishment. The walls heard everything. The floors carried every moan, every scream, through the cracks in stone, to the servants below. And though they were sworn to silence, the palace itself, remembered. You notice, now, that the portraits above the fireplace are all watching. Faces frozen in oil and varnish, their eyes a warning. You are not alone here, you never were. No one who entered this room ever truly closed the door. Not the king, not the girl chosen for him, not the courtier, waiting outside with ink-stained fingers, ready to document what happened behind those crimson curtains. So when you ask what the king's bedroom was, Don't imagine warmth, or silk, or laughter. It was none of those things. It was a prison dressed in perfume, a courtroom without mercy, a vault where power slept with paranoia, and dreams were replaced by surveillance. And in that silence, beneath, the scent of roses and sweat, something ancient still breathes, waiting to be remembered. You think you're alone here, but listen closely. Behind the wallpaper of royal silence, something stirs. The hush of slippered feet, the creak of invisible hinges, the scratch of a quill dipped in ink. The king's bedroom, so grand, so cloaked in velvet and gold, had walls thinner than you imagine. Because here, even privacy was performance. You step to the far side of the chamber. The fire crackles low. The air carries a different scent, now ink, wax, parchment. You run your fingers along a carved oak panel. There, a groove, a notch, ... a breath of cold air. You push, and behind the false wood, a hollow tunnel opens. This is no myth. Behind the king's bedchamber was an entire nervous system of hidden corridors, narrow stone arteries where servants scurried and spies crawled, secret staircases twisted behind, chimneys, crawl spaces snaked between bedroom walls, small holes, no wider than a coin, bored clean through the plaster. Some were cut behind mirrors, others behind tapestries, and on the other side, and I always waited. Sometimes it belonged to a scribe, a court recorder charged with documenting the consummation of royal marriages. The moment the new queen was led to the bed, trembling in embroidered silk, the moment the curtains were drawn, but the sounds still pierced through the silence, a brief gasp, the shift of limbs, and finally the groan of inevitability. The court needed proof, not of affection, of function, of heirs. These bedding. Witnesses wrote everything down, every gesture, every silence, even the way the queen turned her head. It wasn't erotic, it was administrative. Every sigh carried political weight, every silence treasonous, and they weren't the only ones listening. The king's enemies, both foreign and domestic, bribed pages, laundresses, even bed warmers. A careless whisper in the dark could reach the ears of an ambassador by sunrise. Jealous rivals planted servants within the chamber, not to serve, but to observe, and when the king wept, if he ever did, was never in solitude. You feel it now, don't you? That sense that your breath is not just your own, that even as you stand in the stillness, someone else is recording you. There's a reason you never see windows open in portraits of royal bedrooms, because the real windows weren't made of glass. They were cut into the wall's watchholes, disguised as knots in woodwork or folds in the drapery, places where the walls bled secrets into the palace beyond. And then there were the rituals. You see, on certain nights, the court was invited in, not figuratively, literally. Ministers, bishops, and dukes would crowd the royal chamber to witness the act of bedding. The king and queen, both newly wedded, were walked to the bed with fanfare, candles, music, laughter choked behind painted fans. They would lie beneath the covers, their faces stony, while the court slowly backed out, leaving them to fulfill their duty, but not before someone stayed behind. Always someone, documenting the noises, the time, the reactions, not for history, for verification. You hear a creak now, not from you, not from the floorboards, from the tapestry near the bed. Behind it was once a man, quill in hand, ear pressed to the wall, recording a king's fears, or a mistress's screams, or a sob. he dared not name. You look to the mirror again, but it does not show your reflection. It shows the place behind you where someone once stood, and if you stand still long enough, you may hear it, a faint scratching, ink against parchment, because in this room nothing was ever truly private, not desire, not betrayal, not even the quiet moments between breaths, and the king. He never truly slept alone. You stand at the foot of the bed and wonder what it meant to lie beneath those curtains, not as a ruler, not as a lover, but as a girl she was. 20, draped in ivory silk, skin powdered pale, eyes lined in shadow. Her name is forgotten, but her function was not. She was the queen, or rather the vessel, and the bed was not hers. It belonged to the state. You feel it in the air, the cold pressure of expectation, the scent of fertility potions, mugwort, clove, bitter fennel. No one speaks it aloud, but it hangs in the chamber like dust. She must conceive. She must deliver. Not a child, but an heir. And so begins the grotesque theatre. Every month, her cycles are charted by royal physicians, old men with ink-stained fingers and no shame. Midwives are called to inspect her linens, her pulse, the color of her urine. They whisper about her hips when she walks. They watch what she eats, what she does not. The king's body, once a symbol of divine strength, is now matched against hers, a girl barely grown. She is not allowed doubt, nor desire. Her womb is a battlefield, and she is told, again and again, that this is her highest purpose. And when the time is right, and the most fertile night, she is summoned, not asked, summoned, escorted from her chambers by a procession of servants. Each step toward the king's bedroom is ceremonial, watched, measured. The court watches her body as if it were a calendar made of skin. Inside the room, the bed has been freshly perfumed. The sheets are changed, the canopy drawn. A rosary may lie on the pillow, a relic beside the mattress. Some kings liked music, others demanded silence, and once the curtains are pulled closed, the performance begins. But it is not private, not truly. Behind the walls, someone listens. Behind the door, a secretary waits to record what time she entered, and when she leaves, what time she departs. If she cried, if she limped, if she smiled, the stakes are monstrous. A successful coupling could earn her glory. A failed one could end in exile, or worse, replacement. The palace does not wait long for a womb that fails. And when the queen's belly does not swell fast, enough, the whispers start again about her bloodline, her curse, her worth. You see, this was not a union of hearts. It was a transaction of bodies, and the king, he might return to his mistress afterward, or to another girl, one not required to give birth, only to be silent. The queen, however, is not allowed such escape. She is inspected monthly, and then, one day, finally, a missed cycle. A flutter in her belly, hope. No pressure. The physicians arrive with scales and scrolls. Every meal she eats is dictated. The bed she sleeps in is re-elevated. Her body becomes a state of emergency, both celebrated and imprisoned. The pregnancy is not hers. It belongs to the dynasty, and when the baby comes, whether alive or not, the queen is praised or punished accordingly. If the child is a girl, disappointment. If it is a boy, relief. If it dies, blame. And always, the bed remembers. The sheet stained in childbirth, the pillows torn by nails, the cries that echo even now behind the walls. You look around the room, but it feels smaller now, more suffocating, because here, even creation was corrupted. Here, the miracle of life was chained to power, and the girl 20 alone, afraid, was never seen for who she was, only for what she could deliver. They say a bed is where we are born and where we die. In this room both were true. You turn from the embroidered pillows to the wooden beam above the canopy. Sturdy, old. A king once had it carved from oak, hauled from the forest where traitors were hanged. A warning, not a decoration. And the irony, that same canopy would one day witness death, not from rebellion, but from within the walls, because not everyone who lay in this bed came willingly. Some were dragged. It's quiet now, but centuries ago this room rang with screams, those of wives who displeased their kings, mistresses accused of sorcery, or daughters who spoke when they shouldn't have. A bed, yes, but also a stage, because royal punishment didn't always take place on a scaffold. Sometimes it happened between sheet silk covering cruelty, candlelight disguising control. You imagine one such night, the door bursts open, guards march in, a woman no more than 25 is seized from her chambers. Her crime, refusing the king's hand, or perhaps being too clever. They don't take her to the dungeon, they bring her here. She knows what it means. The bed is not prepared with comfort in mind. There are no petals this time, only silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. She is placed in the bed and bound by silk cords, not for intimacy, but for control. A priest is called, or a notary, sometimes both. Witnesses are always necessary for what comes next, not because it is sacred, because it must be recorded. The king enters last, his steps slow, not hesitant but ceremonial. He does not look at her face. She is no longer a person, only a message. He takes his place beside her. A moment passes, and then the ritual begins, not of love nor desire, but of dominance disguised as duty. She screams, and they will write it down. She resists, and they will call her mad. She weeps, and they will say she is hysterical by morning. If she survives, she will be sent to a convent, or to the tower, or worse, to the sea. Her body now carries the scent of power's darkest instinct, to consume. This canopy has watched it all. It has watched queens beg for mercy, watched bastards be conceived in silence, watched young boys die in their sleep before coronation, smothered beneath these very sheets by unseen hands. Crib death, they wrote. But servants whispered of ambition. And what of the bedding? It was changed daily, but the memory remains in the wood. No perfume can erase it. You breathe in now and catch something bitter, something old, fears soaked into fabric. Even the servants refuse to sleep here. They'd rather rest on cold stone than under the same canopy that watched betrayal after betrayal unfold like silk ribbons unraveling. You wonder, why not destroy it? Because power has a strange memory. It doesn't erase its sins. It frames them, polishes them, calls them tradition. This bed became part of royal myth. Children were told, behave, or you'll be sent to the king's room. Brides were warned, produce an heir, or you'll be dismissed like an anteth, and even kings feared it on their final nights when illness overtook them and their breath grew shallow. They knew what the bed required, not peace, but performance. Even in death, they would be cleaned, robed, and positioned just right, arms folded, eyes closed, crown resting beside the pillow, so the people could come and see, not a man, but a memory. You reach out, run your hand along the bedpost. It's smooth from centuries of contact. It's not just wood its witness. 1,000 bodies have passed through this space, but how many souls left pieces behind, and how many were taken? History is often told through the eyes of kings, but what of the hands that changed their sheets? The truth is, no one knew more than the servants. They moved silently, like shadows in velvet hallways. They were trained to see but never speak, to clean but never disturb. And yet, it was in these quiet figures that the true memory of the palace lived, especially here in the king's bedroom. Every morning, they entered the room with heads bowed and voices low. The scent always told them how the night had gone. Rose oil and wine meant a mistress. Iron and bile meant illness. But sometimes the smell was colder like fear. Those were the mornings they cleaned quickly, with shaking hands. There were servants who had seen queens weep into pillows, who had removed blood-stained sheets without asking questions, who had picked up pearl earrings torn off during royal arguments. They whispered the palace's truest stories to one another, not in words, but in glances, like the time a servant girl found a child's toy beneath the bed, but the queen had never given birth, or the time the king's hunting boots came back clean after a supposed 3-day ride. The servants knew. They knew when an affair began before the lovers did. They saw the shift in body language, the extra care taken with hair, the quiet jealousy over a misplaced glove. They knew when a marriage was over before the wedding feast had ended. But they couldn't speak. Not aloud, so they became archivists of silence. One old maid, her hands gnarled by decades of labor, used to say, "The bed doesn't lie. The people in it do." She had tended to 4 kings, buried 3, and with every death she would remove the linens with reverence, not for the man, but for what had been endured in that bed, because she knew no crown was worn without consequence. There were also the night servants, those unlucky enough to be stationed just outside the chamber. If summoned after midnight, they entered with lowered eyes and stiff backs, never knowing what they might find. A weeping bride, a raving king, drunk on port and paranoia, or silence, too deep, too final. One boy, a candle-bearer, once entered the room to find the queen seated beside the king's body, his throat bruised. She claimed he had choked, but the servants saw the imprint of her necklace chain in his flesh. He said nothing. The next day he was promoted. These were the small, brutal exchanges of palace life, truth traded for survival, loyalty bought with secrets. And there were rules among the staff. Sacred ones. Never speak of the bruises on a princess's wrist. Never mention the midnight visitors. Never ask why the king's surgeon entered through the servants' hall. Break these rules, and you didn't just lose your position, you disappeared. But despite it all, the servants didn't hate the royals. Not always. Some pitied them. Others loved them. In the quiet way one loves a broken bird. They bandaged their wounds, changed their chamber pots, brushed out their hair, and watched as power corroded the people they once were. And when a king finally died, no matter how cruel, there was always a ritual. The servants would come together before dawn. They'd light a single candle. One of them would open the bedroom door, slowly. No noise, no ceremony, just presence. Then, together, they'd wash the body, not because they were commanded, because they were the last ones who saw him as a man, not a monarch. They'd clean his skin of perfume and powder, comb his hair, dress him in white, and when they laid him back into the same bed where he once took, commanded, raged, and decayed, they'd whisper the same thing, every time. Rest now. The kingdom no longer needs to fear your breath. Then they'd close the doors and begin scrubbing the sheets, because no matter how the night ended, the morning always demanded silence. She was more performance than person by the end. The queen, history painted her as grace incarnate, a vision in lace, a hand forever raised in calm control. But behind that raised hand was a wrist bruised by diplomacy, and a heart shredded by a crown that was never truly hers. Her bedroom, unlike the king's, was not a place of command. It was a stage, a place where she rehearsed every expression before entering court, where she practiced her smile in the mirror until her cheeks ached, where she wept privately, wiped it all away, then emerged serene and spotless. Every silk curtain in that room was drawn to perfection, every rose in its vase replaced daily, every book on the shelf, unread but selected for appearance. It was not a room of rest, it was a prison dressed in pastel. And the queen, she performed her captivity with elegance. No, one knew exactly when she stopped sleeping, but the night maid began finding her seated in front of the mirror at 3 a.m., still in full dress, unmoving. Sometimes she'd whisper rehearsed lines under her breath. I am honored to be his wife. The kingdom is strong. I have no personal feelings on the matter. The mirror never answered back. Sometimes she'd stare out the window, not at the stars, but at the freedom beyond them. She'd once said to her lady-in-waiting, out there they marry for love. I married for peace, but war still came to my bed, because the king didn't need a partner. He needed an emblem, and she became one. But emblems are hollow. Over the years, she grew thin, not from illness, but from erasure, her own desires ground to dust. She wasn't allowed to be angry or jealous or joyful. She could not age, could not cry, could not scream. So all those emotions gathered somewhere, unseen, until the day they broke through. It happened during a banquet. The king had risen to toast a foreign duke, one rumored to have once tried to seduce her. He laughed, joked about her youthful beauty, called her a peace treaty with perfume, and something in her snapped. She didn't scream, didn't weep. She simply stood, smiled too widely, and poured her entire goblet of red wine across the king's lap. The room froze. He looked at her, shocked, but she met his eyes and said, the costume is stained. Perhaps now they'll see the performance for what it is. That night, the queen did not return to her bedroom, and for 3 days the palace buzzed with rumors. Had she fled? Had she been locked away? Was she dead? On the 4th morning, the curtains in her chamber were found torn, her gowns slashed, and in the center of the room, on the floor, lay her crown broken clean in half. No blood, no body, just absence. It was never explained. The king said nothing, and the kingdom moved on. The royal portraitists were summoned. Her likeness was preserved, in paintings for generations. Soft eyes, pursed lips, always obedient. But those who had known Horelli, known her, saw something else in those brushstrokes, a smirk hidden behind the smile, a quiet rebellion in the eyes. The maids say that sometimes, late at night, her chamber door creaks open on its own. A breeze moves the curtains. The scent of roses, real roses, not the dried ones used for ceremonial, lingers in the air. And the mirror, it is still there, but now it always reflects 2 figures, the viewer and someone seated behind them, always watching, always waiting for the curtain to fall again. He was born with his eyes wide open. From the moment that Queen screamed his name into the stone walls, To the second, the midwife gasped and said, "He's watching me." The prince was different. He refused to cry, refused to sleep, refused to be held by anyone but the queen, whose arms, too frail from years of forced elegance, barely contained him. And even then he wouldn't close his eyes. Not once. "He doesn't dream," whispered the nursemaid. "No," corrected the wet nurse. "He dreams, while awake." They tried to lull him with lullabies, swaddled him in velvet, lit lavender candles, paid monks to chant over his crib. Nothing worked. He remained alert, always watching, always silent, always silent, always. Remembering Dot, because that's what terrified them most. The boy remembered things he shouldn't. At 3, he walked into the great hall and pointed at a knight no longer in favor. "He's the one who kissed mother's hand too long." At 5, he passed a servant and said calmly, "She was the one who cried in the hallway the night my father locked the queen inside." At 6, he stood beside the king's throne and murmured, "You lied when you said the war was over. It was just moved into her bed." The king sent him away, far from court, far from mirrors, far from the queen's memory, but sleep still didn't come. Instead, the prince began writing, not in ink, but in charcoal on his chamber walls. Symbols, phrases, fragments of dreams that weren't his yet, felt inherited. "The crown is made of teeth." She danced without feet. "The king bleeds from a wound he won't admit exists." She is not gone. She is just waiting for silence to speak. The castle doctors were called. They said he was mad, but the steward said, "No, not mad, just born into a nightmare and too awake to pretend it's a dream." By 12, he was quoting the queen verbatim, not the public speeches, but the things she whispered behind closed doors, her thoughts, her regrets. "She used to whisper into my hair," he told his tutor. "But she died when you were 9, the tutor replied. "Not the queen," the boy said, "the woman trapped inside her." Eventually, the king stopped asking for updates. He treated the boy like a ghost. But the servants knew better, because late at night the prince would wander the halls in bare feet, trailing cold behind him like a mist. He'd stop outside the queen's chamber, the one locked since her disappearance, and place a hand on the door. Then he'd whisper, "I remember the real you. You didn't disappear. You became me." One night, at 15, the boy stopped eating, stopped speaking, locked himself in his room. When they broke the door down, they found him sitting cross-legged in front of his mirror, stone-faced on the wall behind him. Scrawled in black soot was a single sentence: "To sleep would be to forget her, and I will never let her be forgotten." His eyes were dry, his posture still, but his reflection, it blinked, smiled, tilted its head, and the prince, who still would not sleep, just nodded back at it. There had always been a mirror in the queen's chamber, tall as a man, wide as a doorway, heavy as a secret. No one knew where it came from, not the artisans, not the priests, not even the queen herself. All she said when asked was, "It was not made, it arrived." And from the moment it arrived, things changed. People began avoiding their reflections. Servants crossed the room to dust around it. The king, once vain, ordered it to be covered in velvet, but no matter how many layers they draped, it would always shed them by morning. It wanted to be seen, and it saw everything, not just your face, but your thoughts, not just your body, but your secrets. It had no memory of what was shown to it, only memory of what it stole. The queen would often stand before it for hours, unmoving. Some said she was admiring herself, but the guard who once peeked through the crack in her door told another tale. She was arguing with herself or with something, using her face. They said, over time, her reflection began to move before she did. They said, when she left the room, it remained. They said the mirror didn't show the queen anymore. It contained her after her disappearance. The king tried to have it removed, but no one could lift it, not with 20 men and a team of oxen. Worse still, one of the men, just a stable boy, glanced at his own reflection before pulling the rope and collapsed screaming. It touched me. It showed me my mother's death. And I hadn't even known she was dead. She was killed that morning in a fire. From that day on, they sealed the chamber, bricked the door, let ivy cover the windows. But the mirror, remained, watching, listening, waiting. Years passed. Then came the prince, awake and aching and full of impossible memories. He knew of the mirror, spoke of it often. She's not in the mirror, he once said. The mirror is in her. No one understood what he meant until the night of the thunderstorm. The prince, now 17, walked through the castle halls in silence. His eyes were red not from crying, but from the refusal to blink. He stopped before the bricked-up wall, laid his palm flat against the stone, and whispered, "Let her speak." And the bricks cracked, one by one, like teeth loosening in old gums. They crumbled. Dust fell like powdered bone. Behind it, the chamber, undisturbed, undecayed, and in its center, the mirror still silent, smiling. He stepped inside. No torches, no guards, no prayers, just him, the rain, and the glass. The prince stood before it, taller now, but just as sleepless. And the mirror didn't show his face, it showed hers. The queen, but younger, wounded, pale, alive. She reached toward him from within the glass, and when he reached back, their fingers met, yet no surface cracked, no ripple passed, because the mirror wasn't glass anymore. It was memory, it was promise, it was truth, refusing to die quietly. The boy began to speak. "I know what they did. I remember the screams, the locked door, the lie that you fell ill. The real reason the king took lovers, because you no longer believed him, and because belief was the only thing holding his rule together." The queen inside the mirror whispered something. It sounded like it wasn't a mirror, it was a door, and I closed it before he could break me. Tears filled the prince's eyes for the first time in his life, but he didn't blink them away. He let them fall, and as they did, the reflection shifted. Now it was the queen and him, side by side, same eyes, same sorrow, then just him, but older, crowned, alone, and behind him, in the glass, stood the people, all of them, all those who had vanished, forgotten, silenced, broken. They were watching and waiting, and the prince understood this wasn't just a mirror, it was judgment, and he would be its vessel. The king awoke that morning to silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence that creeps in after something terrible has happened, and no one has yet dared to speak of it. His guards were missing, his wine remained untouched, and his hounds, usually snarling for meat, were curled in the corner, eyes wide, ears flat, as if they had seen something unnatural. He rose slowly. His joints ached like they were trying to warn him. But kings do not listen to their bones, they listen to their pride. Outside his chamber, the halls were empty. Paintings had been turned to face the wall. Mirrors had been smashed, every last one, even the small silver one in the prayer chapel, all except one. He knew which one. He did not speak her name. He hadn't in years. But it still echoed in his chest like thunder locked behind ribs. She was just a woman, he once told the court. A queen must support her crown, not challenge it. But even as he said it, he had felt the lie cut through him, not like a sword. Like Redgreath King descended toward the sealed wing. Or rather, what had been sealed. The bricks were gone. The dust swept clean, and in the center of that long-forbidden room, the mirror, it had changed. Where once it reflected, now it revealed. Not light, not form, but consequences. He approached it slowly. Not as a ruler, but as a man. And for the first time in decades, the mirror showed him something true. The night he broke her, he had her dragged from the council chamber, not because she defied him publicly, but because she was right, and he couldn't bear it. He ordered her locked in her room, not to be harmed, but not to be heard. Just until the nobles forget, he said. Just until the people stop asking. But they never did. They just stopped speaking, because one by one, anyone who mentioned her servant or senator was sent away, or vanished, or turned up in rivers. Now the mirror showed their faces, all of them, women, men, children, advisors, maids, tutors, midwives, all. Those who had carried even a whisper of her truth. Their eyes were not angry. They were mourning him, not the man he was, but the man he could have been. He reached out, trembling, to touch the glass, and it burned him, not with fire, with memory. His hand recoiled, and that's when he saw himself, but not as he was, as he would become a man, old and alone, surrounded, not by subjects, but shadows, not by family, but consequences. And beside his deathbed, the mirror, watching, always watching. Is this my punishment? He whispered aloud. The mirror said nothing, but in the reflection behind him, a figure appeared. The queen, no longer young, no longer angry, just tired. She looked at him with pity so deep it hollowed the room. You were afraid of truth, she said, so you tried to silence it. He fell to his knees. Forgive me. Her eyes did not soften. You do not ask for forgiveness. You ask for relief. And then she turned, walked backward into the glass, and vanished. The mirror shimmered, and from its depth the prince stepped forward. He was no longer a boy. He was a storm in waiting, eyes clear, voice quiet. Your reign is over, he said to the king. The king didn't protest. He merely nodded, and for the first time in his life, he bowed not to his son, but to the truth that night. The bells rang, not for war, not for victory, but for change. And, as the castle filled with light and the people filled the courtyards, the old king stepped out onto the balcony, not as ruler, but as witness. He raised his hand, and with the last of his strength, he spoke. The crown does not make the truth makes the crown. And I let mine tarnish in silence. And, with that, he turned, and walked back inside, where the mirror awaited one final time.